people end up creating the conditions that cause disasters. You know, nature sort of does its thing, and the problem with disasters is that we get in the way. One of the things I think that the 1910 flood teaches us is to think carefully about that human-nature interaction, how we build our cities, how we build our infrastructure, because some of those things will have an implication for what happens when a flood takes place or some other kind of natural event that we may or may not be able to anticipate. For a lot of people, the 1910 flood is kind of the worst case scenario. It's the benchmark that they use when they're thinking about flood planning, disaster planning, relief efforts. In the years after World War II, they finally built these reservoirs upriver on the Seine, and the reservoirs are designed to take water out of the river to try to lower the water level. But it's not necessarily successful. It's still, you know, there's still a high volume of water that comes down, and once it hits the city, it starts to move in surprising, sometimes in interesting ways. In 1910, a lot of the historic sites were affected. The Eiffel Tower was surrounded by water, and the area all around the Eiffel Tower. The Louvre was not flooded, but there was a real fear that it would be flooded. And so there were teams of men outside the Louvre sandbagging, putting up huge walls of sandbags to try to prevent the water from coming over the walls and flooding the Louvre. There were a lot of other places, a lot of residential areas that were flooded, a lot of people's homes, a lot of people's businesses. There were wine warehouses that were flooded, and so there are great photographs of big barrels of wine floating down the river. In fact, people would stand on the bridges and watch the debris floating down the river and even sort of bet on which piece of debris would make it to the bridge first, and sort of have these little races, so to speak, between the different bits of floating furniture or debris, things that they saw in the river.